4 pulmonary veins that go into the left atrium, 2 right and 2 left. There's the pulmonary artery right here. The pulmonary trunk comes off the back of that. You just don't see it in this drawing. But this is the right pulmonary artery going to the right lung. This is the left pulmonary artery going to the left lung. This is the posterior interventricular sulcus between the left ventricle and the right ventricle coming down the back here. This is the this sulcus going along this way is called the coronary sulcus, remember, and these are coronary. This is the main coronary vein that collects the blood that has percolated through the heart muscle itself, called the coronary sinus. Okay, this is where the heart sits in the quiet of your own house tonight. Go home and feel for your PMI. The PMI means the point of maximum impulse. PMI, you'll see that in charts all the time. PMI was at the fourth intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. In other words, first intercostal space, second, third, fourth, at the mid-clavicular line. So if you could if you put the clavicle in this picture, where it's not, right now it goes from here out to there, that's about halfway out the clavicle. That's where it should be. Now, if your PMI is way out lateral, that's usually because your heart's way too big, and you're probably going in heart failure, or you have some problem with your heart not working correctly. The heart gets bigger. And then you may feel the PMI even out here into the sixth intercostal space, almost at the lateral end of the clavicle. So go home and feel it. You may have to lean over forward to feel it a little bit, but you can always feel it. Let's talk about the wall of the heart itself. It has an epicardium, it has a myocardium, and it has an endocardium. Now clearly that's pretty easy. The epicardium is simply the outer layer of the heart. It's really the visceral pericardium, but you don't really identify it so much as that because it's just stuck to the heart itself. It covers the heart. Myocardium is where all the action is. That's where all the muscle is. That's the muscular wall of the heart. It has lots of concentric layers of heart muscle that go in kind of all directions. And I'll just leave it at that. The great vessels have myocardium that kind of wraps around them to help hold them all together. There are 2 divisions of the ventricular myocardium. We'll talk about that a little bit. Endocardium is the inner layer. Remember that the inner layer of the heart, the inner layer of all the veins, the inner layer of all of the capillaries, everything is all simple squamous epithelium. It's 1 cell layer thick, and it's a very thin cell. Same goes for the inner lining of the heart. The endocardium here is a magical surface because it allows blood to flow past it all the time, and yet it never forms clots. Okay? This is why the artificial heart has never been able to be made workable. Because any time you put foreign material, whether it's silicone or some kind of lining, to a mechanical heart, it forms clots. And when it forms clots, those clots break off, they go to your brain, patients get strokes, goes to their kidneys, they get kidney failure, and it goes everywhere, and it kills them. So artificial hearts have, the first one was actually installed by Christian Barnard back in South Africa, back in like 1965. And they put in 2 or 3 more. Denton Cooley and Michael DeBakey installed a couple of them in Texas at the Texas Heart Institute, but they all failed, and patients usually lived about a week with an artificial heart. It's gotten a little better. They're using assist devices these days, but it's a very complex problem, and this is the reason it's a complex problem, is the endocardium. So this is kind of what it looks like in schematic form. The endocardium is that 1 cell layer thick stuff on the inside, you can call it endothelium if you like. There's a little bit of areolar tissue built that's just underneath the endothelium. Then you get into the layer of the heart muscle, and you remember the heart muscle is a striated muscle. It has singular nuclei as opposed to multinucleated like your skeletal muscles. It has these little line jobbies, which are called intercalated discs. That's right. I think this picture up here is kind of important because you kind of get the impression from that picture that the heart doesn't just beat like this. The heart kind of wrings itself out with each heartbeat. It's kind of a twisting motion. And someday you should all get a chance to go into an operating room and see an open heart surgery, and you actually get to see the heart and see it beating. Pretty cool. Here's those intercalated discs. Remember, the function of the intercalated discs is to connect the cardiac cells together, both physically, mechanically, I guess physically is mechanical, chemically, and electrically. So the whole thing here is, the fact is, the way that heart muscle works, the way your heart works, is it all squeezes together. And so we really need all of the heart muscles to contract at the same time. It doesn't make any sense if this part squeezes and then that part squeezes, things like that. It has to be beating together. And of course, intercalated discs help make that happen. You can also notice that the nuclei are in the middle of the cell, and there's tons of these little guys called mitochondria, right? What do mitochondria make? ATP. And what is ATP? Used what? Yeah, it's the energy. It's the energy of your heart. And since your heart is working 24/7 from the minute you're born, way before you're born, until you die, you hope it never stops. And so you need lots of energy in there, and that's what the mitochondria do. Nice picture here of cardiac muscle. You need to go back and look at cardiac muscle under the microscope. It's still over there in the boxes. Characteristics of the muscle cells, they're pretty small. They're not real long like the skeletal muscles are. They have a single central nucleus. They have branches. The muscle branches. That's something that's completely different from skeletal muscle or smooth muscle. And they have intercalated discs. That's another thing that's completely different with cardiac muscle. Let's talk about the internal separations of the heart. One is called the inner atrial septum. And the inner atrial septum is just what it says it is. It's the septum that divides between the two atria. So it divides the right atrium from the left atrium. And you probably remember there was a little valve. Maybe you haven't had that. Fossa ovalis, foramen ovale. Y'all had that yet? I'm getting blank looks, so guess not. We'll cover it here, and then it'll come back to it when we get into development of babies. The interventricular septum is just what it says it is. It's the big muscle separation between the two ventricles, whereas this one is just kind of a little layer of tissue that separates the two atria. This one is a very thick piece of muscle that adds to the contractions that are going on in those ventricles. AV valves, we talked about them. They are the valves that separate the atriums above from the ventricles below. The idea of heart valves is they only allow the blood to flow in one direction, and we'll talk about that. The right atrium has several openings inside of it, and you need to identify each one of these on your hearts when you get it and on the models that we have over there. So the superior vena cava is bringing in blood from the top. The inferior vena cava is bringing in blood from the bottom of your body. And the coronary sinus is bringing blood back from the heart itself. So the coronary arteries that go out and percolate through the heart muscle then collect back, and they come back and enter that vein that's running on the back side of the heart that I showed you earlier, and it dumps into the right atrium. So it has its own separate little opening, not a big deal, but you ought to be able to identify it. The right atrium, you should also be able to see the foramen ovale. Remember that the foramen ovale is before birth, is an opening between that connects the right atrium to the left atrium, once again to allow blood to go in a funky direction because the blood has such a hard time getting into the lungs themselves. and it's very high pressure there. And it doesn't need to go to the lungs because it doesn't do the baby any good because there's no oxygen in the lungs to start with. The foramen ovale snaps closed at birth, and it seals off immediately because of the pressure changes when that baby takes that first breath of air. And then it just becomes a little scar, and you can see it into adult life actually as the fossa ovalis. So it becomes just a little divot or a little cavity called a fossa. Also in the right atrium you'll see these muscles called the pectinate muscles. They're just on the wall of the atrium. Once you get your heart and open it up, you'll see all of these obvious muscle fibers that are sticking out, and you see them on the in a lot of them in the right atrium. So this is not a good picture to illustrate that. You can they're sort of saying here these are pectinate muscles. Of course they are. But you can actually see them from the inside. And they look kind of like these guys do down here. These are like, these are muscle groups too. Notice how the inside of the heart is not smooth at all. But the endothelium is magic, like I said, and it keeps clots from forming in all of these places. There's the fossa ovalis. So there's 3 holes that go into the right atrium. There are the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the opening of the coronary sinus right there. Also notice there is a fossa ovalis. That's that little fossa that snaps closed at birth. And then of course there's one exit out of the right atrium, and that is down through this valve here called the tricuspid valve. Interventricular septum here. Interatrial septum is not really illustrated very well here, but it's just a thin membrane between the right atrium and the left atrium. Some kids will be born with an atrial septal defect. In other words, they have a hole in their heart that connects between the right atrium and the left atrium. And what happens if there's here's the interatrial septum right there. I didn't see it on this side over here. So blood will flow back through there from the left atrium over here to the right atrium, and then basically it just gets another trip through the lungs. It's already completely oxygenated because it just came from the lungs, but it gets another whole trip. So these kids can go into heart failure, and so they usually try to let them go a couple of years, let them get a little bit bigger. It makes the surgery a lot easier if the kid's a little bigger. And then they put a patch over that hole and close the hole off. The right ventricle has these things called chordae tendineae. These little stringers that come down here are the chordae tendineae, and they connect to the cusps. There's 3 cusps. Remember, it's the tricuspid valve. It has 3 cusps that form the valve. Now, think of it like this. I can only illustrate it with two. I don't have 3 hands like the tricuspid valve, but I'll pretend like I have 3. And what happens is the valve opens to let the blood flow down, right? And then it snaps back shut. Now, the importance of these guys right here, these chordae tendineae, is it does not allow the valve to go like this and evert itself backwards, okay? It gets to that point, these things are tight, and it closes. It does not allow the leaflets of the valve to flow back up into the atrium and then allow blood to flow back up backwards through the valve, which is abnormal. Other thing that's really interesting is these little guys right here are called papillary muscles. And these papillary muscles are attached to those chordae tendineae. Once again, you will see these very clearly on your heart dissections. You have them both on this side and on that side there. And think about them like this. Why would you have to have a muscle attached to those cords? Well, the reason is because as the heart contracts, then this whole area would come up, right? But if you have a muscle in there that can shorten, it'll keep it from going up so much and keep that valve leaflet from flipping back up into the heart as well. So those muscles are very important. They're called papillary muscles. Here's a couple over here. And my story about papillary muscles is I didn't do heart attacks. I didn't take care of people with heart attacks. But I remember there was this guy who had sold me a car. He was a car salesman out in the Dalles, and he came in and he was on one of the internist services, and he had a heart attack. And this was like his second day after his heart attack. And he seemed to be getting a little better, and then he just, boom, instantly died. He was gone. They couldn't get him back. They couldn't understand it because there were no electrical changes. It didn't look like he'd had an additional heart attack. What had happened was that his heart attack, which involved this piece of muscle out over here, also involved his papillary muscle. And so when the papillary muscle, it's dead now, and it still needs to hold on to that thing, but suddenly it died and it broke. And so now the papillary muscle is gone. These little cords are no longer attached, and that valve is just flopping in the breeze. And the guy, he can't pump any blood, and he died like that. That's called a ruptured papillary muscle, and it's one of the worst complications of a myocardial infarction.
How does someone get diagnosed with that? Do most of them just end up dying?
Yeah, most of them just end up dying. Yeah. Because it usually happens in the 1 or 2 or 3 days after a heart attack, and that's not a time to be operating on people because they're so sensitive. You could extend their heart attack if you did anything to them. So yeah, that's a papillary muscle rupture. Okay, I think we've been over all of this. Oh, here's another thing down here that you need to see on your hearts. There's one particular band of muscle down here in the lower part of the right ventricle that's called the moderator band. Now, it looks just like all the rest of those muscle bands down there, except it is more prominent and it sort of sticks out on its own a little bit. The reason it's important is it contains some of the nerves that carry the electrical signals around through your heart. Remember I said that the way the heart works is it's got to all squeeze together, and we have a pacemaker of our heart that lives up here in the atrium, and that pacemaker sends electrical charges down through a series of nerves that mostly run through your interventricular septum down here, and then part of that nerve also continues across out here through the moderator band. So the moderator band plays a role in pacing your heart and getting it to all contract together. You'll see it in lab. Free edges attached. Free edges of the valves have chorditendinae. They attach to papillary muscles. They prevent the valve from opening backward, just like I tried to illustrate with my hands. The one on the right side is called the tricuspid valve. It has 3 cusps. Prevents backflow into the right atrium. This is really a cool picture, I think. This is from inside the heart. I think this is not a living person. Why do I think that? Well, because best I can tell, that's water in the heart, not blood, because you can see through it, right? So here's a papillary muscle. Here's the chorditendinae. This would be the edge of the valve up here. These are those thick muscles on the inside. Papillary, oh, these are the papillary muscles right here. What are these things called? What?
The pectinate?
Yeah, pectinate muscles, thank you. In the right ventricle, which is what we were just looking at, there's these trabeculae carni. That's another name for them. They're just these muscular ridges on the inside surface of the right and left ventricle. You guys have all heard of, what's that Mexican dish? Carne asada, yeah. Carne asada, that's where the word came from. That means meat or muscle. Carne asada means, I don't know, is that the spices or what's carne mean?
That's meat.
Meat. Carne's meat. What does asada mean?
Just the way it's marinated.
Just the way it's marinated, yeah, fixed up. Okay. So here's that moderator band. Remember, you only find the moderator band in the right ventricle. Going out the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary circuits, we call the upper part of the right ventricle the conus arteriosus because it's kind of a cone that kind of tapers so that the blood comes out and it gets kind of coned up into the pulmonary artery. Conus arteriosus leads into the pulmonary trunk, which is just another name for pulmonary artery, the main pulmonary artery. It goes up there a little bit and then divides into the right and left. And obviously it comes out through the pulmonary valve as well. The pulmonary valve has 3 semilunar cusps. Now, the difference in a semilunar valve and that valve I just showed you that had the little strings attached to it, the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles, the semilunar valves, and there's 2 semilunar valves in your heart. One is this one here, the pulmonary artery, pulmonary valve, and the other one is the aortic valve. They are shaped like little semilunars. They look like little moons. We'll have some pictures for you later, but if you think about this is the artery right here, and let's draw it. Has 3 parts. 1, 2, 3. And these 3 parts are just little leaflets that these are really illustrated by my hands here. So when they open, they go down, and then they snap back. And they just fit just right to close off like that. Both of them are tricuspid valves. Both the pulmonary valve and the aortic are tricuspid semilunar valves. There are no stringers hanging onto them. They just fit right, and that's how it works. I'll show you better pictures in a minute. Let's go to the other side of the heart now for a minute. The left atrium. Blood gathers in the left atrium from the lungs, comes in through the right and left pulmonary veins. Remember, there's 2 of each. There's 2 right ones and 2 left ones. And it gets delivered into the left atrium. Left atrium, it then passes down through the left AV valve, which is also called the mitral valve, or the bicuspid valve. So this valve's got 3 names. It's the only valve in your body that has that only has 2 cusps to it. The semilunar valves all have 3. The tricuspid on the other side has 3. Why is it called the mitral valve? Well, for those of you Catholics in the crowd, you've probably seen these kind of hats that the Pope wears and some of the big bishops wear. And they're called mitres, M-I-T-R-E, mitre. And if you think about that hat, it's got 2 parts. And if it could open and close, it would open and close like that. But that's where it got its name. The mitral valve is the only one that just has the 2 flaps, front and back.
Bicuspid, right?
Huh?
They're bicuspid.
Bicuspid.
Is that what it is, name?
Yeah, I just know the mitral valve means the same thing because some questions will use the word mitral valve. The left ventricle is the one that really does the work of your heart. It's a little bit larger looking. The muscle is much thicker and more powerful. It looks pretty much the same on the inside, except it does not have a moderator band. Blood leaving the aorta through the left ventricle leaves through the aortic valve, goes into the ascending aorta. It becomes the aortic arch, and then it turns around and goes downstream as the descending aorta. This is really an important point. The right ventricle and the left ventricle pump exactly the same amount of blood with each beat. In other words, if this thing holds 150 cc's of blood, this thing here holds 150 cc's of blood. Think about it. It's got to work that way. You can't have one ventricle pumping more than the other one because the blood would build up in either the lungs or out in the body, right? They got to both keep working together, and they got to be both pumping the same amount. That doesn't mean they're the same shape, and you remember that the blood pressure that this thing over here generates is only 30/3, And the blood pressure that this thing generates is 120 over 80. So this is much more powerful, but yet the volume of blood, the amount of blood pumped with each heartbeat is exactly the same. Notice that the right ventricle kind of hangs around the outside. The left ventricle, the powerful one, is more round. Notice that the wall of the left ventricle is much, much thicker than the wall of the right ventricle because of that pressure business we were talking about. There's before contraction and after contraction, and I just want you to realize that they both pump the same amount of blood at each heartbeat. So let's go back and talk about the valves a little bit. The valves are all one-way valves. In other words, they let blood go through, but then they snap back so that blood doesn't backflow. The AV valves are between the atriums and the ventricles, so there's a right one and a left one. We have other names for them. On the right side, we call it the tricuspid valve. On the left side, we call it the mitral valve. They both have these chordae tendineae and these papillary muscles. The other heart valves are called semilunar valves. These are the pulmonary and the aortic valves. They're both tricuspid valves. They have no muscular support. They have no little cords hanging off. But the cusps work just like a tripod. There's a tripod right there. You know how when you open a tripod, it kind of goes, and it reaches a point and just stops. Well, that's what these do. That's kind of the way they work. The aortic sinuses, this is a hard concept, I think, for you guys to understand sometimes. But let me just take a minute to tell you what an aortic sinus is. Well, that's a terrible picture. Here's the ventricle. This is the left ventricle, LV. And it comes out here through the aortic valve. Right there, and remember it's a three-way semilunar valve right there. And if you took a slice down through that, it would look like this. Here's the aortic wall, and here's those three cusps coming up like this, and up like that to meet in the middle out here. Okay? This area right in here, just above the cusp, is what's called the aortic sinus. Now, why is that important? Well, think about it. When this thing squeezes, it pushes all this blood up into the aorta, and then when it's empty, it stops flowing, it snaps back a little bit because the aorta is kind of elastic, and when it does, it causes these valves to snap shut. Okay? And the blood comes back here for a little half second, and it fills these sinuses. Well, over here on the wall of the aorta, coming out of here, is where the coronary arteries exit. The right and the left coronary arteries come out of the coronary sinuses just outside of the heart. Okay? I'll explain to you why that's really important shortly. Okay, if you could take a single slice through the heart, like right up here in this picture, you'd notice that all four heart valves are actually in the same plane. They're just lined up just like that. So you got these two valves. These are illustrated as being open right here. So this is the tricuspid valve. This is the bicuspid or the mitral valve into the left ventricle. This is the right ventricle over here. Here's the two semilunar valves that look like this. This is the aortic valve closed. This is the pulmonary valve closed. And you notice they're made up of these three little and then so there's a little sinus out here just above this thing, and that's where the blood can get out to go into the coronary arteries. I'll come back to that. So here's an example with the blood flowing out, and then they're going to snap shut, and these are going to open. So you never have both sets of valves open at the same time. This set is closed here, and this set is open. And if I go back to the last picture, it's just the opposite. These two guys are open, these two guys are closed. Yes?
So the coronary arteries in both of the semilunar valves?
No, just in the aortic valve.
Just the-
Coronary arteries just come off the aortic
Okay.
aorta. They don't come off the pulmonary artery, which would be above the other semilunars. Good question. This is a terrible picture, I think. I think this side of it looks pretty good. This is all in the shadow here. But these are two of the leaflets right here. There's one, and there's the other. This is what they look like open, but to me that's just, somebody colored that in with a red crayon or something. That's why I have all this explanation down here. But yeah, this is a nice view of how the semilunar valves work. They just meet up just right. Now, think about it. What would happen if this valve was kind of scarred and it didn't meet up just right? If it didn't meet up just right, when those valves snap shut, it wouldn't close completely and blood would flow backwards through it. Well, that's not the worst problem in the world, but it just means your heart has to work that much harder to pump it again, right? If it regurgitates, you got to pump it again to keep it going on around your body. So we'll get to those things later. This little fiber skeleton, the cardiac fiber skeleton, is just there to stabilize the valves and sort of to insulate the ventricular cells from the atrial cells. Because the way we want this to work is we want the atriums to contract first, push the blood down in the ventricles, and then we want the ventricles to contract together to pump the blood out. Okay? So it is important when we're going to start talking about electrical charges being passed around through your heart from your pacemaker and things to make your rhythm just right. It's nice that the atriums are sort of insulated electrically from the ventricles, because you want the atriums to contract first, ventricles to contract second. Coronary circulation, I mentioned to you already, involves coronary arteries that send the blood into the heart muscle itself. Remember, that heart muscle is about 2 inches thick. So it takes a lot of blood flowing into the heart. And remember, the heart is incredibly active, so it needs lots and lots of oxygen to stay beating. The coronary arteries, they both come off in these aortic sinuses that I've kind of mentioned it to you. It's a high blood pressure in the aorta just coming right out of the heart. There's this strong elastic rebound force that allows this blood to flow between contractions. Think about that for a minute. Why would you want the blood that's going into the heart muscle itself to go in there when the heart is relaxed? Well, it would be pretty hard to push blood into the heart itself if the muscle was all contracted around those arteries, resisting the blood flow. So we need the blood that's going to flow to the heart itself to not flow during systole when all the rest of the blood is flowing, but rather when that blood snaps back into those coronary